Hi, classmates. I'm Kate Hawk, and I am entering my third year in the PhD program. And I'm here today to talk to you about Professor Michael Bamberg, who is a professor of psychology at Clark University in Massachusetts. But originally, he got his master's in 1975 in Marburg, Germany. He got a Master's of Philosophy in 1978 from the University of York in England, and he got his PhD in 1985 at the University of California in Berkeley. So right now he's a full professor at Clark University since 2001. He was part of a Spencer Fellowship. He has taught in Denmark, Germany, Brazil, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. And he has too many publications to list. He is the editor of Narrative Inquiry, and he's also on the editorial board for Discourse Processes, Discourse Studies, Thymos, Boys Studies Journal, and Psychology of Language and Communications. So he also speaks 7 languages. Sounds like a great guy to take a class from. So if you're interested in learning more about Dr. Bamberg after my little talk, this is pretty self-explanatory, but he's all over the internet. You can watch a lecture of his on Who Am I? He has 13 lessons from his teaching at Clark University. So go for it. His areas of research include identity, discourse, positioning, narrative, male adolescence, and post-adolescent identity studies. And I'm going to focus on 2 of these interests, but they all sort of work together for him historically and intellectually. So the articles that I've used here as I've gotten to know Dr. Bamberg a little bit are listed. There's 2 from 2004, both of which deal with young male identity entering adolescence, and a study that we are going to be reading from 2006, Stories Big or Small and Why Do We Care? And this is a major theme of his work. And then the last one, I was so lucky. I did not end up contacting Dr. Bamberg, but I found this interview with him from 2016. So luckily the interviewer did a lot of the work for me. So one of his big themes is big stories versus small stories. And his basic argument here is that, and this is a quote from him, the small story approach is able to theoretically and methodologically enrich traditional narrative inquiry, not in a peaceful complementary fashion, but by more radically repositioning the big story approaches as grounded in dialogical, discursive approaches, such as small story research. So he has worked with this woman, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce her name right, George Kopololo, and a couple of articles about small stories. So the big story idea is these are confessionals. They're cathartic, they serve a purpose, and Kim says these are stories that provide relief for the narrator. Bamberg describes big stories as letting one's life pass one by and then drawing some conclusions about that life. He says that 60 to 70% of research on identity is using big stories and not focusing on the real formative small stories that are going on in mundane, everyday situations. So he looks at the small stories as really analyzing what people do with their talk and how they build their identities through that talk. So analysis is involved. And for those of us on the discussion board that have been thinking about, what is analysis? What he really focuses on a type of discourse analysis in order to look at these small stories. So another big theme is adolescent male identity building. And the piece that I looked at, Dr. McVie actually tipped me off to it. It's an amazing piece. And this particular one that has the link is called, it basically focuses on a short segment from Stephen King's Stand By Me movie, where Gordy, the storyteller, tells a story about a barforama. Now, if you want to click on the link, it's really gross if you haven't seen it, but Dr. Bamberg is pretty fascinated by adolescent male identity, and some of the other titles of some of his work include You're Right, It Is Nuts, We Can't Trust Girls, Strip Poker, They Don't Know Nothing, Positioning Identities in Adolescent Male Talk About a Television Game Show. Another one is It's Weird, I Was So Mad, Developing Discursive Identity Defenses in Conversational Small Stories of Adolescent Boys. Another one is titled We're Young, Responsible, and Male, Form and Function of Slut Bashing in the Identity Constructions in 15-year-old Males. So you can see that small story using this young male identity building is a big part of Dr. Bamberg's work. So this video is the Davy Hogan story, and I'm not going to tell you any more about that, but you would, if you like Stephen King, if you have bathroom humor, if you have teenage sons like I do, you'll get a kick out of it. But basically, he uses this snippet from a movie, from a larger movie, to really go in depth into boy identity building, especially in the ages of 12 to 13, sort of adolescent changing, time of change in a boy's life. So I would highly recommend it. So some of his thoughts about his own work and himself, he sees himself as a developmentalist, and he says that this is part of his problem with the big story, that as adults, are we ever done developing? So if you're doing an autoethnographic piece, how and why do you decide that this is the story you're going to tell at this time? And if you were to wait a year, 5 years, 10 years, would your story look differently? Small stories, however, account for identity shifts in everyday situations. So he does talk about, in his interview, the single story narrative, which he also equates with the big stories. So if you watch the single story video that Dr. McVie put on our Blackboard, he's talking about some of the same things that Adichie is talking about, and how your perception of your story changes. Another big question that he thinks about is, are we monologic selves or are we dialogic selves? He says, do others deform our true selves or do they help form them? So if you were reflecting in our brains, is that monologic talk, or don't we need to talk about our experiences with others in order to make sense out of them? Another big idea he has is investigating memory and how memory is used in narrative. So he says, what you think happened is brought into a pre-existing structure of talk, and your memory adjusts to fit the current context. Some other big things for us to think about. He's also very interested in this 2016 interview about multimodal analysis of storytelling, and I can see him dabbling in that with the video from the Stephen King movie, Stand By Me. He's talking about when you listen to people, when you're transcribing, it's one modality, but if you're watching them and how they act with each other, how much more we can get out of it. So that's sort of where he's headed. And certainly he was headed there 10 years ago, and I'm sure he's on his way. So he also talks about what is his future work. So the things that he's thinking about now going forward that he'd like to investigate are, what are the differences among identity, narrative identity, and forming a narrative self of identity, as well as thinking about the question of who am I through different narrative approaches. And we've certainly been looking at those different narrative approaches, especially in the Kim chapter, chapter 9, where we read all the different types of narrative approaches. So he's a really amazing researcher, and I really liked his sense of humor with his work. He does have a psychology background, and you can really feel that coming through with all of his identity work. So I know my eyes are all over the place in this video. I'm trying to look not at myself in the corner, but at you. And I appreciate your attention. If you have questions, you can email me. You see that at the bottom of the screen. And I would recommend going back and checking out some more of Dr. Bamberg's work on the links. Okay, thanks. See you soon.